Hi, Alan Sides, back one more time to answer another question. This question is, what do I do before I mix? And it's very important to me that I deliver a product that satisfies my clients, but also satisfies me. I'm a bit of a sonic snob, and I like things that sound bigger than life. I like things that are exciting and fun to listen to. And to attain that, one of the first steps I do is to, if I go into a studio, and I work at a lot of studios. I mean, I certainly work at my own studios, but sometimes I'm at Village, I might be over at Sunset Sound, I might be at Abbey Road in London. And so the first thing I do is set up my speakers, and sometimes they're my speakers, sometimes they're not. But I set them up, I balance them up, and I listen to material that I really know well. Particularly material that has a lot of bass, that's got a nice relationship between where the vocal sits and the bass sits. And I listen to it, and I do the best I can to rebalance the system to make it sound correct for what I'm listening to. Every control is different, and it doesn't matter what speaker I'm using. Now, a lot of times I will have a sub with the left-rights, and that works really well because even if the control room has acoustic issues, I can balance out the sub so that I can play something I really know well. I can balance the sub to where I know the mids and highs match the bass. So when I do my mix and I push the envelope, I know exactly how far I can go. And once I've got that together, the next thing I do is determine every possible reverb, delay, and effect that I might want. I want to be accessible. Now, generally speaking, mostly I mix on analog consoles because I love the sound of doing an analog equalizer and remixing the analog domain. In analog, I can repaint the picture. Even if it's not a good recording, I can do pretty amazing things to bring that back. If I mix in the box, and sometimes I have to do that, I almost always come out in stems. So I'll have maybe 8 stereo stems. I'll go to a custom little mixer that has 8 stereo stems. So, and the reason I do that is because in Pro Tools, when you mix in the box, the biggest sonic issue is that if you have a lot of tracks and they're all recorded at a pretty good level, you have to turn the tracks down in order to not overload the final stereo mix. And when you turn tracks down in Pro Tools, it truncates the sound. It actually gets smaller sounding. So I think part of the problem in the box is this fact you have to turn down a lot of the channels. So if I'm mixing to stems on a separate mixer, then I can have a drum stem and a bass stem and a background stem. All those can come out at the levels they're recorded at. I mean, I may do rides and stuff, but generally speaking, they're not turned down. They're basically coming out at roughly the level they're recorded at, and I find that sounds much better. And that's primarily why I use the stems. Now, in the analog domain, mixing analog consoles, I just love the sound of analog cues. I can't help myself. And if I'm mixing in the box, unless I patch an EQ on one of the stems, if I'm all internal and I go back to, say I want to use an analog equalizer on one instrument, I have to do a D to A and an A to D, and there's a pretty good degradation just in that in order to use the equalizer that I want to use. So generally off, I'm better at staying with plugins. Anyway, in regards to reverb and such, usually what I do is I'm very fond of a couple different reverbs. And I'll usually say an Eventide 2016, which is an older Eventide reverb that I love the sound of. And the stereo room on that, I'll set that up, balance it out, and then I'll usually get I like the TC6000, has a really good verb, I'll get that going. The 960 Lexicon, there's a reverb in that I like a lot, and I get that going. And if I'm in a studio that has a great plate, I may set that up with the right pre-delay and the right EQ on the front end, have that going too. And then I'm still fond of the stupid RMX16 1580S AMS. I like the RMX16 in the non-lid mode, not for drums per se, but I love the way it sounds on electric guitars and certain instruments. It adds a certain ambience or an aura that I think is really neat. And of course the standard, the AMS 1580 with the twin harmonizer, twin delay, the Phil Collins setting, that's pretty fabulous on background vocals and such, so I like to have that available if I can. And of course UA does have a good plugin for that. That sounds pretty nice. And then the other thing is I like to have the Ocean Way Room. The Ocean Way Room plugin really helps me a lot because if I'm mixing stuff that I didn't record and there's no room mics, I can create pretty amazing ambience. And even if I'm mixing something and there's a couple of dead instruments, even there's 2 people singing simultaneously, and maybe I want it to sound like they were standing in Ocean Way Studio B and I'm standing in front of them, hearing them in stereo in the room, I can create a separate ambient track and print it for each of those instruments or people, and then I can actually make it sound like I'm standing in front of them in a live room. and that he's left and then that she is right, however you want to do it, but yet they're standing in front of me, and having that is an invaluable tool for me. So I do use the Ocean plugin quite a bit. The other thing I like a lot is the DBX subharmonic synthesizer. I'm a bass player and I love low bass, and every once in a while, even though I'm a bass player, sometimes I can use it, like if I got a snare that's too high, I can add a little of the subharmonic synthesizer, and it adds a weight to it that no EQ can add. And also, because there's a little delay between when it actually triggers, a lot of times I'll print that, and then I'll move it closer to the snare, and so that it doesn't hang out too long. And I can get it adds a nice weight to it. Sometimes I can use it on kick too. Same thing, I can move it so it's closer to the attack, and it doesn't hang on quite as long. So that's a nice device. And then EQ-wise, I'm very fond of the original ITI equalizer, which George Masson put first EQ, which I think sounds pretty stunning, fantastic highs. I like the Pultec EQP1A3s. I think they're pretty great. I love the Lang PEQ2As. Those do something that's very unique. They have the 15K on that thing set narrow band sort of ring modulates when you boost to a certain degree, and it creates harmonics that didn't exist in the material. So you can get this fabulous silky air out of it. It's a very unique EQ. And then I love the API 558 EQs. So usually I have a whole raft of analog EQs as well. And so when I'm ready to mix, I've got all this stuff at my fingertips, and basically I put the track up and I get it going. The other thing I do is level. I find a level that I think is comfortable to mix at, which is a more modest level first. This is where I'm going to set most of my vocals and everything else. And then I figure out a level that's a bit louder, and it might be 100 dB or 102 or something, that range. And I will maybe get my initial track sounds on that first, just to make sure it's big and it's punchy and it's loud, everything sounds fine. Then I'll bring it down to my more normal level, and that's where I do most of my rides. I'll sit there and I'll balance everything in very carefully, and I'll make it sound right. And the other thing I should talk about is bus compressors, which I'm really not fond of. Now, my thing is, if you use a bus compressor, it does make mixing easier because it fills in all the holes, because it just brings up all the level stuff. The problem is, if you balance out the threshold so the first verse sounds really great, by the time you usually get the bridge, if it's a big tune, it just goes underwater. Basically, the snares and everything just get mushy. And I'm an attack freak. You can't make it punchy enough for me. Forget about compression. I want to expand. I'm looking for it to be as dynamic as I possibly can. To me, you just can't make it wide enough. You can't make it big enough. So I love to not compress my mixes. If after I'm finished with a mix, I think with a teeny bit of peak limiting, I can get the overall volume of the mix up, I'm okay with that. But generally speaking, I would almost never use a bus compressor. And it's funny because owning 18 studios and having all these clients, my dear friend Bruce Whitting, who mixed all the Michael Jackson stuff, he never used the bus compressor ever. But what he did do is he would listen to every song, he would look for every hook and every lick, and maybe Nathan East would do one little bass bump that sounded amazing, and he basically would ride every detail, anything that created emotion or improved the mix. Bruce wrote it to do that. And I'm into that. I think that makes a huge difference. I look for any moment that I think creates sonic excitement. Maybe it's a rhythm guitar, but there's one spot where it's glued, and you bring it up at the right spot, it really delivers. Same thing with percussion. Because the other thing I kind of miss is, in the old days, mostly I'd record all my percussion stereo, and having real organic percussion, like having Paulina DaCosta playing shakers and all these congas. The stuff just sounds amazing, and I do miss the sound of real analog percussion. Now, continuing on, the other thing I have is, if what I'm mixing, I didn't record it and say this kicks and snares, which is not very happening. I do have my Ocean Way drums samples available to me. I can do them at 96K, and I can take almost 100K samples of kicks and snares and bring them in, and I can do sound replace if I need to do that. And then I can use the Ocean Way room to sort of glue them into the existing drum sound. Now, the other thing that's important to do is, if I'm mixing something that's 96K or it's 192, it's a high sampling rate source, what I'll usually do is, when I do the mix, I always print a first generation 44.1 right off the mix bus. Because the one thing I never want to do is have to do a D. If you go 96 to 44, or even 48 to 44, there's a noticeable degradation. So I always like to have a first generation 44. The other thing I do is, when I'm mixing, sometimes I need to master what I do because pretty much it's where I want it. Rarely do I add any EQ after I've done a mix. So mostly what I do is I'll look at the entire tune, I'll look at the level, I'll bring the whole thing up until I'm hitting reds. And then I'll push it up till it's noticeably distorted. Then I'll start bringing it down and I'll find the place where maybe I hit 8 or 9 reds. As long as I cannot hear the reds, I couldn't care less, because it can be a great peak limiter, but you have to be very careful, because if you go over the threshold, if you go too much, it's nasty. Digital limiting can be, digital overloads are pretty nasty. But what I can do, if I may hit a dozen reds, I can bring the level of my tune up 3 dB without a compressor. And so, and the other thing oftentimes I'll do, I often ride the master fader, and I'm looking at it and I'll figure, okay, well, if I bring the bridge and the chorus down just a little bit, I can bring the whole mix up another 3 dB. So maybe I can get the whole mix 6 dB louder than it would be if I did nothing else with no compression. And so when I'm printing this directly to 44.1, which would be that's going to be the format that most people will hear. It's a first generation, right off the mix box, directly from my custom converters. And I have that as a reference point. Then I always print a high res. So if it's 96K, I'll print a 96K. And so I have that to deliver, to Apple at a later point when they do eventually release high res. I have it for any audiophile things I want to do. And generally speaking, if I was to master in the analog domain, and I did decide that I wanted to do some EQ, I would come off the high res 96K, do that EQ, and then analog go back to the front end of my 44.1 converter. I think that's the best way to do it sonically. Anyway, these are a few thoughts I have, and hopefully that's been of some help. Also, if you have a chance, please subscribe to our new YouTube video channel. I'm going to answer a ton of questions. Thanks.